from your perspective, if there is ending the war and cleaning out that area, Egypt's on board, and we can really hermetically close that space.
1,000%. And finally, yes, bring in. I mean, I call for bringing in a non-Israeli and a non-Egyptian on the Palestinian side, and a party that's agreed upon by all. And it could include Jordanians, it could include the Emiratis and the Saudis, and bringing in the Saudis, I think, to monitor the area, to ensure, and the United States could help with technologies to detect tunnels, like from a security and a technical and a political point of view, I think it's entirely solvable, this Philadelphia corridor. And plus, again, Israel is going to have tight eyes on, in terms of intelligence, ISR, to monitor what's coming in, what's going out. I don't think smuggling into Gaza is going to be what it used to anytime soon.
Welcome to the Z3 podcast. I'm Amitai Fraiman. I'm the director of the Z3 project. This is our podcast. Today's conversation is the third that I've had with my friend Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. He's a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's moving to DC soon, so you should follow his work as he takes it to the next level. This conversation, in the three-part series, I'd say the first part was much more about Ahmed's background, his upbringing, and his experiences in Gaza. The second episode was a little bit more about the current situation and the realities. And this one was, we try to take it in a forward future or hopeful direction. And these conversations with Ahmed are always inspiring to me. They're not always easy. Obviously sitting with someone who has a very different experience than I had growing up. But I find it incredibly important and in line with what we do here, because we have to build bridges. We have to look to the future. We have to figure out how we can move forward and create a better place, a better world for everybody. And that's really core to our mission here at Z3. So this conversation with Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib is the third in our series. He's a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I hope you enjoyed this episode and this series. Follow us on our various channels on LinkedIn, on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Join our newsletter and stay tuned for more information about our upcoming conference on November 17th. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome, Ahmed. This is our third conversation. I am really, I've really grown from the beginning. I was excited about these conversations, but I'm happy. You can tell I'm smiling. It's good to be in your presence. It's good to have these conversations. It's our third one in this, what turned to be a series. Mm-hmm. And yeah, welcome back to the Z3 podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Delighted to be here, and sad that for the time being, this may be our last for just a few months until we figure it out. I'm moving to DC, as you know, in the next couple of weeks. Yeah,
that's exciting. I want you to be able to share that also with our audiences, because that's a big deal. I know you had some questions that we didn't discuss on camera, but you were debating in between our conversations. We talked about this, and I'm delighted that it's the plans are forming up, and that I'm sad that we're losing you here in the Bay Area, but for good reason. So excited.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, all right. So, the first two conversations ended up being a little bit, the first one we covered a lot in these conversations. That's the truth. But the first one I felt, if I'm looking back at it and listening back, and by design was we spent a lot of time learning about your background and what brought you to your activism and where you are and your family, and you shared about, the loss that you experienced in the current war in a very open and moving way. And of course your observations of what's going on. And then the second one, we talked a little bit more about October 7th and the current war. Of course, that's the backdrop of a lot of this, but it was more specific. We talked there about public opinion polls. We talked about all kinds of different elements that came up and what we saw in the news of people celebrating. That was a lot, much more actual. And I hope that today, who knows, but I'm hoping that today we cover a little bit more future forward. I think it's good to finish on an arc, a little hope. I described our conversation as pragmatically hopeful, or pragmatically
Precisely.
Optimistic.
Absolutely, precisely.
So so I just, I'm glad we can do this, and I really do want to start. I think my first question, because it's just so top of mind. This happened when we're recording this. This is going to come out later, but it was exposed by the IDF found incriminating documentation that the results of probably the main public opinion poll that was used throughout the war about how the streets in Gaza, how everyday Gazans felt about the war and Hamas, those were fabricated, meddled with, influenced, pick your way. And you said, in that conversation, in our previous one, you told me straight up, look, this researcher is respected and that's that, but I know other research, I know people personally, and that's not a reflection that I know of. And for one, I was relieved, I'd say, when that came out. And so I'm just curious, what how you feel with this evolution of this story, this part of it.
Certainly. Well, it's been, for lack of a better word, a moment of vindication, if you will, in that I have long believed that these polls are unrepresentative of what the people of Gaza actually think, both nowadays and even before October 7th. These polls defied the logic of how could a population be overwhelmingly in favor of an armed group that has held them hostage, that has put them in an awful situation for 17 years, poor quality of life, decimated prospects for a peaceful resolution or a political settlement with the Palestinian Authority or Fatah or with Israel and the broader region and conflict. I've repeatedly said that if you're standing in a dirty, disgusting bathroom line with hundreds of people, if your child is sick and you can't find him a Tylenol, if you're hungry, if you've been displaced 17 times, you lost half of your family, you lost your homes, you're not sitting there saying, wow, October 7th did us a favor. Wow, Hamas is wonderful. Wow, this is going really great. Not just based on the consequences of October 7th, but because you've seen Hamas time and again set the Palestinian people back. I've long questioned the over-reliance, if you will, on polls in an illiberal, undemocratic society that is governed by an Islamist terror organization that is essentially a military dictatorship. Taking it a step further, Hamas has historically invested heavily in perception management capabilities and tools, whether it be through bona fide counterintelligence, the science of counterintelligence, which includes misinformation and disinformation and propaganda, or whether it be through WhatsApp and Facebook groups, whether it be through online trolls, through media manipulation. These polls just did not make sense to me. And people in Gaza have a tendency of telling pollsters what they want to hear. Plus, if these pollsters were escorted or surrounded by Hamas agents and Hamas collaborators and Hamas informants, this is not to say that Hamas has no ideological support or no base of support. But I've long put it at no more than 30%, one-third of the population. And even that 30%, I feel like there's some of them that support Hamas ideologically. Some of them, it's just a job. They get paid by the Qassam brigades or by the social aspect component of Hamas. And so the thing with these, what's been really interesting to observe with these revelations, and I said immediately, I was like, I take anything that the IDF says with a pinch of salt for good reason. And still, I think this confirms a lot what many have suspected, which is that these polls are not to be trusted, even though they've been considered. And that's not to say the pollsters themselves, Khalil Shikaki, who's a respected pollster and a researcher, and it's really difficult to do polling in the Palestinian territory. So the Israeli government, the IDF, the think tanks have long relied on his research. But there were other pollsters that I've talked to who have done smaller sample sizes, and their findings were completely inconsistent with what he had offered. I had never talked to a person in Gaza since October 7th who is not vehemently against Hamas, against October 7th. Tells me stories of how other people around them are reacting to what's happening. And so I've been trying desperately to get this message out, because unfortunately these polls were used to dehumanize the people of Gaza, to say they're all Hamas, they're all terrorists, they all support the killing of the Jews, and therefore we must punish them, we must de-radicalize them, and I've long felt that nothing has been more harmful to the Palestinian people than these polls. That's not to say that we shouldn't understand what Palestinians really think, and I'm also specifically talking about Gaza. The West Bank has a different context in that they've never had to live under Hamas. Their quality of life, as much as the occupation and the settlements and the suffering are tough, is substantially light years ahead of what exists in Gaza. But it's also been interesting to see who's happy about these findings, these revelations by the IDF, and who's upset, and who's,
So before we jump into that, because that part to me is across the board, it's very interesting if you isolate why this group is happy, why this group is unhappy, etc. But I want to go back to something that you said, in the first piece here about feeling vindicated and the difference between what you know to be true based on your own, and it's not just, to be clear, it's not a matter of anecdotal stories. It's speaking to, many people having lived there and having family there, and also speaking to other pollsters, right? So it's not just, I spoke to 10 of my best friends and they told me what I kind of know. It's a much broader thing. So there's that piece which is, I find, important to underline. And then the other piece that I think is really interesting is recognizing that there still is an issue, but I do think that there's even if 30%, right? And let's say it's, as you said, we don't ideologically necessarily believe, but are either paid by or whatever, right? There is still an element that exists, and that's not to say that, and therefore we should now project on the rest, but it's also to say, you know what? Every society has its radicals, okay? And to say that any Western, certainly Western civilizations and societies and countries and cultures, but around the world, you're always gonna have an element that's extreme, and so you have to treat it as such, right? Instead of saying, let's project it on the rest of them. And I think, and this on a personal note, and this is to lead to the next point, which is, who responded. I was so relieved to see that. Not because, we had the conversation, I left it like feeling very hopeful, but just because I now, at that moment knew that not everybody felt that way. I knew that coming to the conversation with you, but beyond that, like I had now information to back that up. That was great, but now that there's a public, like a real public exclamation, that, by the way, is worth noting that Israel could have buried.
Precisely.
Right? Like Israel could have said...
The war was based on these...
a huge amount of decisions. Like they could have said, you know what? And there's a cynical interpretation here as well, which I'm happy to kind of like unpack in a second. But Peter Lerner, right? Former spokesperson of IDF, went out and said like a whole thing of like, guys, we got this wrong, right? And I know that, he's had other conversations as well around this. So all this is to say that it's so interesting to see who's latching onto this as a beacon of hope and like a reason to reconsider, change, pivot, re-engage, and who's not. And I'm curious to see how you're seeing it from your end, and I'm happy then, I'll say.
Well, I've been seeing some of the comment, yes, to your point, again, a lot of the war strategy, a lot of the thinking, a lot of the justification, the ethos of the war has been around, they all support Hamas and they all support October 7th. And we've seen these polls time and again, proving it. So therefore, we need to de-radicalize them. We need to show them who's boss. So that's why what I said, I wonder what's in Israel's interest to reveal those documents if they were in fact fake. If anything, like you said, it would have been just easier to keep quiet. And I'm sure they found documents that they're not sharing with the outside world related to the war effort, et cetera. So it's been interesting to see several folks on the Jewish pro-Israel side, like you said, latch onto is the great word to say, you've been saying this, Ahmed, for 10 months, and I kind of believed you, or I didn't believe you, but now I see there's a there, or this gives me hope. This tells me that, there are a lot of, and it's in a way it's vindicating, but in a way it's also silly in that, of course we should have known that most people in Gaza, in one way or another, do not support Hamas beyond the ideological base of support. It's silly to think that everybody in Gaza, 2.3 million, are all behind Hamas.
Right, but you know what's interesting about that? Because it's, yes, 100%. When you're able to sit down and have a conversation with somebody, and you can follow logic, then of course, right? But when people are in an emotional state, they need to believe anything. And I know it's true in the other way. In other words, right, people will say, all Israelis are IDF soldiers, and therefore they're all doing this, and they all believe that. And it's like, of course they don't belong. It can't possibly be that, right? But it's just easier and more comfortable and reassuring, especially in a moment of trauma, to want to believe anything. But the point is the quick reversal on that is where I find the hope.
Precisely, right? Precisely that. And on the other side, to see the people are saying, this is IDF propaganda, this is not real. Some of them are saying, okay, it's IDF propaganda, it's not real. Some of it are taking it a step further and saying, no, people in Gaza love Hamas. They support the armed resistance group. They're militantly trying to prove the point of the polls because they themselves have basically been duped into thinking that Hamas is an organic expression of resistance, and Hamas is Palestine, and Hamas is Gaza. And instead of separating the people of Gaza from Hamas, they've doubled down on Hamas is Gaza, in a way, in agreeing with the pro-Israel people that they're so against. And so that has both been interesting, revealing, and quite disturbing, to be honest, because I've said this time and again in all my writings and all my posts and all my podcasts, at a time when people in Gaza en masse are turning against Hamas because they're experiencing the consequences of Hamas's actions, at a time when people in Gaza are done and they want this to be their last war, they want this to be the end of Hamas's ability to hold them hostage to its nefarious and useless program, you have droves of people outside of Gaza, and certainly including in the Western world. And I'm not saying every person who's pro-Palestine is that, absolutely not. But you have the mainstreaming of pro-Hamas sentiments within the pro-Palestine solidarity group in a way that I think is harmful to the just and urgent Palestinian aspirations for freedom and self-determination and liberation. And so it's been disturbing to, instead of like, for all of my disagreements with the pro-Israel side and for all of the attacks that I get attacked all the time by the pro-Israel side, because I'm very critical of the Israeli government and of the IDF and of the settlements and the military occupation. But I have witnessed a far more interest in looking at this from a hopeful, let's move forward angle by some on the pro-Israel side than the other way around with the pro-Palestine folks, for whom this is either, like I said, at best just IDF propaganda, as they're used to anything the IDF says is propaganda to them, or at worst, it's like it kind of destroys a lot of their own belief system around resistance and Hamas and the Palestinian cause, and it's more comfortable to just like stay where you're at than to reassess, which I think is a true shame.
Yeah, it is a true shame. It's heartbreaking, because I think that part of what I struggle with in this whole thing, and early on in the war, there was an attempt to make a distinction between, like, they tried to be a bifurcation. You're either pro-war or anti-war, and from a marketing or from a debate perspective, it's like pro-life and what are you, pro-choice or pro-life? No one's going to be anti-life, right? But focusing on that paradigm, I felt like, as someone who admittingly, you know this about me, right? I was in the IDF and I was a tank commander in Gaza in the first in 2009, in Operation Cast Lead. And from a realpolitik perspective, I can understand when it's necessary to use force. Now, does that mean that it should be unbridled and uncontrolled? Of course not. Does that mean that's being indiscriminate? God forbid, right? And I can say from my personal experience, it's never that, right? It's never intentional. I have never been in a situation where it was intentionally indiscriminate. I've been in situations where there was misidentifications, where there were civilians in the vicinity that were unknown, tragedies, heartbreaking tragedies. But that's all to say that, like, I was never in a position of like, we got to go to war. This is a romanticization of like violence, right? This is what it needs to be. This is the desired approach. But I will say that certainly from a perspective of like, well, if all of Gazans, here's a poll, supported this, and I see celebration, and I'm in deep trauma and in pain, then whatever, not all means necessary, but it's necessary. We got to do this. It's unfortunate, right? And then to see something like this, I was like, oh my God, thank goodness. Like, we don't actually have to do this, right? Like the minute we have like the slimmest of reasons to try and to like reel that back in and pivot, precisely. I think was for me. It's like I texted immediately. The first person I texted when I saw this was like, Ahmed, I can't believe it, dude. Did you see it? Like, are you seeing this?
Yes, sir.
And you already
yes,
did,
sir.
of course. But so the broader point I'm trying to make, though, I think, is that in terms of revealing of who, I think it's who's directly affected by this ultimately, who see this as some kind of like intellectual or romantic kind of philosophical debate between perceived good and bad. I think those are the people who are disappointed by these findings.
Precisely. And I have skin in the game to want to believe that these findings are real, because my understanding of how Hamas operates proves that they manipulate, like, directly and indirectly, overtly and covertly, through a whole host of mechanisms and means. I mean, that's what makes Islamist groups stunningly effective. I mean, look who won the elections after Hosni Mubarak was overthrown in 2011 in Egypt. Within a year, the Muslim Brotherhood took over because they are masters of public opinion and manipulation and using data and using like real precise messaging. So for me, and it ties neatly into the theme that we had wanted to kind of describe in our third conversation, is the moving forward piece. Because to me, this also mainly, especially on the pro-Israel side, those who say we basically have to have re-education camp for the people of Gaza, or de-radicalization programs that are so like akin to what we did to the Nazis and whatever. Like, I've long believed that these were overstated, that yes, there needs to be a shift on the Palestinian side, but part of that is the result of lived experience. Like 70% of Gazans have never left Gaza. Like, and it's amazing that it's not even 100% who support Hamas. But again, it's a combination of isolation. You can say for some brainwashing and indoctrination, but also for others, it's like, no, they've lived the consequences of Hamas. They have smartphones, they have TVs. They know that there's an alternative outside, just on the other side in Israel or in Egypt. And they see how the rest of the Arab world has sort of moved on from the Palestine issue, and they want real solutions to their crises. They want to, at the end of the day, to them, you have entire generations of Palestinians that, since Hamas took over, that only know 8 hours of electricity a day, or 8 hours of electricity at a time, or water on for, like, they tell you when the water is coming on, not when it's not coming, when it's going off. So at the end of the day, to them, that's like their most immediate needs, beyond which they want to see Gaza be a prosperous place. And that's what I'm hoping to push for, and that's part of the move to DC. That's part of why I'm working on multiple tracks, both in terms of the narrative, in terms of the humanity and the empathy and connecting with Israelis, and the healing and reconciliation and pushing for peace and coexistence. The pragmatic ideas, the humanitarian solutions, is like multiple tracks to move us beyond this moment. Even though, yes, it's unclear if there's going to be a ceasefire anytime soon. It's unclear what, it seems to be clear that there's going to be some kind of a ongoing military occupation for the foreseeable future, unless that's replaced by something else. But that doesn't preclude us from envisioning an actual alternative and an actual Gaza 2.0.
Yeah, I would actually say that all of that just, it's incumbent on us to continue to imagine that alternative future, because we can't just settle for what is. We have to continuously hope for what can be better. And I want to hear, I'm curious to hear more about some. I'm going to ask you to come up with like a 10-point plan of like, how are we going to revolutionize the conversation and discourse. But I do think that people are curious to hear, some tangible elements or some kind of ideas and movements, and not just, not to put everything on your shoulders, Ahmed, but come on, get to work. But I know, but
I'm doing it. I'm uprooting my life and going to DC.
I know. You're going to, but I think that people are genuinely curious and like, okay, so all right, so the polls were wrong, thank goodness. They don't want Hamas in their lives. How do we now get rid of Hamas, right? How do we create that alternative?
And so it's a multi-tiered strategy. First and foremost, this war needs to end as soon as possible. We need to get the hostages out. We need to surge humanitarian aid in. We need to bring law and order back in there. But there's going to need to be a transitional period, a provisional government, a provisional authority that helps Gaza. It does, and it gradually takes over the security responsibilities. That's why I've long been an advocate for a limited peacekeeping / policing force, largely made up of Arab nations and others, to police Gaza's borders with Israel, to ensure that there is no infiltration, there's no future October 7 type attack anytime soon, and to coordinate with the Israeli authorities to act as a barrier basically between the Palestinians and Israelis, create an early warning system, if you would, control the Philadelphia corridor, make sure there's no more smuggling, no more tunnels that go back to being operational. And then most importantly, to secure the humanitarian aid convoys. Right now, we have a serious lawlessness problem. Armed thugs and gangs, some of whom are part of clans, some of whom are part of former splinter cells, if you will, of Hamas and others, who basically it's every man for himself. They form a small little gang and they rob a lot of the aid. They rob a lot of people. They act as total thugs, and they're right by the Kerem Shalom crossing on the Gaza side, and they just wait for the incoming and outgoing trucks to loot them. So we need this most urgent aspect of it is ending the war, surging aid in, restoring some kind of limited law and order that can protect the aid, and then finally separating the Israelis and Palestinians to allow for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Because if Israeli troops stay in Gaza, that will give birth to Hamas 2.0. That makes Hamas continue to be relevant as a resistance group. Yeah. That generates immense resentment. Now, that doesn't mean that Israel isn't going to be involved. I understand that just from a pragmatic point of view, like if I were Israel, like I certainly would want to, in the short term, address the risk of Hamas coming back to power, address the risk of preventing another, the rearmament, another October 7th type attack. And I don't believe there's going to be a tangible, immediate risk in the near future of something like an October 7th. At worst, we're talking about limited scale, one rocket here, one rocket there that most likely will either fall in an empty area or they'll be intercepted by the Iron Dome. The type of rocket volleys that we saw in the past are, I think, have been reduced to a trickle, if not outright eliminated. We need to deal with the unexploded munitions. I wrote a piece for a think tank 3 years ago now, about how Hamas and other militants use a lot of the unexploded munitions from the shells and the missiles that don't explode upon impact to actually extract explosive materials, and they use readily available items and raw materials from the destroyed buildings to manufacture rockets, just using even plumbing pipes.
Yeah, we've seen those. Yeah.
So those immediate things that like get down to brass and tacks, and this is what frustrates me about a lot of folks who, you know, obviously and rightfully, in my opinion, call for the end of the war is very little public conversations about the immediate steps. People just want the war to end, but I don't want a freezing of the conflict. I want the war's end to be the beginning of political transformation. Yeah. So that's one of the immediate steps that I'm thinking of.
So I want to hear more. I do have just a question there, because it sounds reasonable, of course, right, and even to an extent manageable. I'm not, I'm thankfully not in that position to make it happen. But from an Israeli perspective, right? What do you do with the border with Egypt, with Philadelphia, right? Because I think the biggest issue there is that there's a misalignment almost of priorities, right? And who and why is letting in so many smuggled goods to go into Gaza, and who's going to actually make sure that ends, right? Because can Egypt be brought in as a mature and responsible actor, and to hold that space accountable? Because in theory they should be. It's the border with them.
Certainly. Lots to say there. First of all, there's actually an easy element to this, and this connects directly to why I'm not in Gaza and I couldn't go back to Gaza, which is that between 2005 and 2006, there was an agreement with the European Union to have a Euro police mission that operated the Rafah border crossing. That actually, there were some Palestinian guards on one side, but the border crossing was essentially operated on the Palestinian side by a European police mission. And it ran smoothly. It was a super professional operation, quick in and out. Like some of the best operation of the Rafah border crossing was when the European police mission ran it on the Palestinian side. And so there's a discussion of bringing that back. And it's fun. I talked to so many Palestinians who would prefer non-Hamas and non-Fatah people running it. And this could be a transitional solution for 3 to 5 years until the Palestinian Authority or a rejuvenated Palestinian administrative body can take over. The goal is ultimately for Palestinian sovereignty. But in the short term, we have a precedent of how to operate the passenger crossing. As far as the smuggling you have to remember that what we're seeing in terms of the number of tunnels, the size of tunnels, and the consequences of the tunnels, of all the things that were smuggled, this is like the end of like a 20-year window in which smuggling went through golden eras, and it was on the rise, and then it was on the decline, and then it remained down to trickle. But Egypt largely stopped most of the smuggling in and out of Gaza. Egypt does not know where a lot of these tunnels. Egypt displaced the entirety of Egyptian Rafah years ago due to insurgency, but they were worried about Hamas cooperating with ISIS in Sinai. And so Egypt has every interest in not allowing the resmuggling to take place. And so I think it's important, and also a lot of these tunnels, the IDF is saying, the dozens, these have been around for a long time. These are not new tunnels, and these are not known to the Egyptian authorities, and some of them are dormant. Some of them are no longer operational, if you will, in the sense that, like, everything going into Sinai, northern Sinai, and the Egyptian side of the border is subject to immense scrutiny by the Egyptian military and intelligence. So I'm saying this as like a positive thing. I think people are overblowing, believe it or not, the risk of smuggling once the war stops, and given that a lot of the tunnels have been destroyed.
So you think that, like, because, I mean, Israel has found, has destroyed, and has also suffered, of course, all these volleys of rockets and whatnot. It's an incredible amount of ammunition. Mm-hmm. So that's a factor of just years of aggregation, not just...
Precisely that. And nothing happening during the war, and nothing happening
during
after.
the war, sure, right, okay. So you're saying, so from your perspective, if there is ending the war and cleaning out that area, Egypt's on board, and we can really hermetically close that.
1,000%. And finally, yes, bring in, I mean, I call for bringing in a non-Israeli and a non-Egyptian on the Palestinian side, and a party that's agreed upon by all. And it could include Jordanians, it could include the Emiratis and the Saudis, and bringing in the Saudis, I think, to monitor the area, to ensure, and the United States could help with technologies to detect tunnels, to like, from a security and a technical and a political point of view, I think it's entirely solvable, this Philadelphia corridor. And plus, again, Israel is going to have tight eyes on, in terms of intelligence, ISR, to monitor what's coming in, what's going out. I don't think smuggling into Gaza is going to be what it used to anytime soon, possibly never. Again, we're talking about the sum of 2 decades worth of smuggling. Yeah. And remember that between 2011 and 2013, we have a situation where the borders were practically wide open and smuggling. And I went to the Gaza borders in 2012. I was there in April of 2012 on the Egyptian side. I didn't make it into Gaza. Right. I was, my brother was with me, and I took him there just to see the borders myself. And it was out in your face in the open. The trucks were coming in. I saw livestock. I saw rebar. I saw cement trucks. I saw trailers with cars, and they were putting them into tunnels. Hamas, from 2011 to 2013, made millions of dollars taxing. That's how they financed the government, taxing these tunnels. And then when Sisi came to power and Hamas aligned itself with the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian government and the military and the intelligence all went after all of those smuggling routes. And even then, and by the way, a lot of the munitions in Gaza came in from Libya after the fall of Gaddafi's regime. Vast stockpiles made their way across Egypt, but also there were smuggling routes that Iran was sending some weapons through Sudan. And that was part of the normalization treaty with Sudan in 2020 with the Abraham Accords, was an attempt to basically get Sudan in part to clamp down on the smuggling. So again, we're talking about things that, the infrastructure that enabled the accumulation of firepower and technology and know-how are no longer in place. And it is also true that Hamas manufactured a lot of things domestically with the know-how and from Hezbollah and from the Houthis and from Iran. So I genuinely think, from a security point of view, during this transitional period, we can easily put in mechanisms and structures in place that are dynamic, that ensure no more smuggling, no more bringing in of illicits, and that everything is above ground for everyone to see.
Yeah, pun intended. But I think that so that's super helpful, and I appreciate that. And I think that, I that's almost like a prerequisite, right? Like, we got to take care of that, right? So let's say we take care of that. That's good. That's set. We're all happy with that piece. What can we do, or what can be done, to kind of try and diminish the ability of Hamas to going back to power, That's question A. And question B, and this is, again, this is like only from like an Israeli perspective, right? Certainly not someone who's lived there, who's gone through it. So I don't know, and I want to be, educated in this to an extent. But the perception is similar to the polls that we discussed in the beginning of this episode, is that governance is not the strong suit of those who have been managing or speaking on behalf of the Palestinian people. I'm trying to be delicate here. I don't want to offend anybody. And the question is then how do you? It's like I wouldn't say it's a deeper shift. It's like another order of of reorganizing. It's fine. Okay, law and order. Okay, security. Okay, but I was like, wait. Assuming that the end game is a democratic country, right? So there's some deep changes that need to happen as well. I think in terms of how what's expected, I guess, of what happens next. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like how do we do that? Because I mean, clearly, Ahmed, like you and I are here right now in Palo Alto, okay? Like we're steeped in this stuff. You spent here a majority or a large part of your life already, right? And that has informed your worldview for sure, and not in a similar way me myself as well. But that's, as you said, 70% have never left Gaza, right? So how do we kind of imbue the discourse with that? How do we kind of encourage that?
Well, I do feel confident that beyond, when people are like, where are the Palestinian leaders? Where are the visionaries? Like, there's an incredible amount of talent that already is there. That, I mean, the Palestinians are the most educated among the Arab world, the lowest illiteracy rate. And so I'm confident that the Palestinian people, if given a chance, particularly mid-level and lower-level bureaucrats, talents, academics, NGO workers, statisticians, like scientists, doctors, would absolutely play a pivotal role in Gaza 2.0, in the governance game, if you will. And so to me, it's not an issue of the Palestinians necessarily need to be taught how to govern per se. They need help with the resources. They need help with the guidance. They most need help with leadership. A leadership that is invested in seeing Gaza become the beating heart of a future Palestinian state, and seeing a leadership that does not want to use Gaza as a citadel for launching new attacks on Israel. I think that once that is set in motion, and I feel confident that even people, by the way, like there are some people who worked under the Hamas government who were simple bureaucrats, who were not, this was the only government in town, and they are not ideologically aligned with Hamas. And if given a chance, again, I feel confident that Gaza could absolutely prosper and do well. The main problem is Gaza was run by Hamas, which had a set of priorities dedicated to armed resistance and attacking Israel. And so it was placed under a sanctions regime, not just the blockade, but international sanctions. And it made banking really difficult, and financial transactions and the transportation of cargo in and out really difficult. So like spare parts for the water treatment stations, and Hamas would siphon off like a lot of the fuel for the power plant. So there was just tiers and tiers of issues that were created by the priorities of the leadership. Not so much that the people who were actually administering Gaza were also not able to. Does that make sense? So it was a leadership and a priorities problem, much more than it being a talent problem.
Right, and just to reinforce that, it's not just like, oh, this is a failed state or a bureaucratic structure that it worked, but it was informed by a terrorist organization, as you said earlier, right? And so the priorities and even people's ability to say anything different was very limited, right? So you're actually saying there's a lot of talent, there's a lot of know-how. They just need to, if that element is removed and people are allowed to rise to the top and propel a different version or vision for Gaza, we have the people.
Absolutely. And to also be transparent and to bring in another less comfortable element into this for some, is that the pushback to that would be to also by people who are in the West Bank, who are part of the Palestinian Authority, who say, We have committed to nonviolence. We do security coordination with Israel, yet because of the settlements and because of the policies of the military occupation, we have not been able to prosper in turning also the West Bank into the economic engine that it can and must be to get the Palestinians.
Say more. Can you?
So there's a lot of talent in the West Bank.
Right.
People ask where are the Palestinian leaders, the alternatives to Abbas and to Abu Mazen and to the current old guard, if you will. And similarly, I say there are a lot of mid-level managers within the Palestinian Authority whom, if given a chance, would absolutely rise and thrive and do well. But they would say that I can't operate freely. Gaza is a different story. But I'm talking about the West Bank, in that there is a case where we have the talent, where we have leadership that isn't exactly perfect or immaculate by any stretch, but nevertheless tried to focus exclusively on peace, keeping the peace, and growing the West Bank into a prosperous territory. And they were hindered by the settlement expansion and by the military occupation.
In other words, so they were hindered both externally and internally. Is that what you're saying?
Well, but they would say more so externally by the Israeli policies, that they had effective governance. They were on the
their
path.
Ability, okay, so let me just make sure I understand. So their ability to do anything material on the ground is limited by Israeli policy.
Certainly.
So they're just like, we would have done this and this, but we can't because of A, B, and C.
Precisely that. Now, why do I bring that in? Again, just to reinforce the point that we have a lot of incredibly smart young people and mid-level managers and mid-level bureaucrats and mid-level leaders, if you will, that I couldn't name right now off the top of my head, and neither could you. But if we give them a chance, if we create the space for them, they will innovate. They are creative people. They are patriots. They want to work, and they're patriots not in the sense of I want to eliminate Israel, but I want to serve Palestine. I want to be a part of a nation building. And that's what excites me and gives me hope, is that the next phase is going to be of nation. Like, this is what I try to tell people about Gaza and the Gaza 2.0 and reimagining Gaza and re-envisioning Gaza. And by the way, I believe in a Gaza first approach to once again do what we should have done as a Palestinian people, I think, in the territories, which is turn Gaza into a role model for effective Palestinian self-governance and what the West Bank, an occupation-free West Bank, would look like. Yeah. And so it gives me hope that there are a lot of Palestinians who want to build the nation, who want, if they're put to work, if they're guided, if they're given the space and the resources, and certainly if they're not killed by the military operations or occupation or the settlers, then they absolutely would thrive and they absolutely would focus on building themselves and becoming part of a prosperous state. Right. And I see that, I've seen that before, but I think in Gaza, in a Gaza context in particular, the West Bank is a lot more tricky. I actually think solving Gaza in the medium term is easy. Yeah. I think the real monster is the West Bank. Now, going back to the thing about Hamas, I mean, I don't want Hamas to be a part of a future, Hamas in its current shape and format. I think the open-ended question and the uncomfortable one is the different modalities in which what remains of Hamas is engaged, is transformed into something different, is rehabilitated. Because remember, Hamas is going to be ultimately part of the big picture, the equation. Yep. And so I push for a pragmatic effort to try to attract the more, the non-criminal, the non-violent, the ones who are not implicated in a lot of the violent actions, to be part of this new process, because we can't just oppose. And to be clear, this is different than saying, this is not me saying Hamas needs to be part of the future per se. This is me saying that there needs to be something beyond simply outright exclusion, beyond just outright exclusion. And I don't want Hamas in its current shape to take part of elections, because we've tried that already. If you're not going to renounce violence and acknowledge Israel's existence and Israel's right to exist, and if you're not going to be a part of the regime of agreements that the Palestinian people have signed on to in Oslo and afterwards, that made us part of the international community, you're of no service to the Palestinian people. You're just going to bring us back. You're going to bring sanctions. You're going to bring further isolation. So I don't want Hamas to have a seat at the table, especially after the October 7th. I'm simply saying that there needs to be some mechanism for engaging what remains of Hamas after October 7th, after the war, to allow some space for transformation and rehabilitation and reform, and to isolate the hardliners and make sure that they can't be spoilers to the future of Gaza.
Yeah, I mean that sounds totally normal and reasonable. Another way to say it is to say, look, Hamas represents a
component.
It's a component, but even if you say, look, I'm trying to be very charitable here, and maybe people will get upset about this, but what I'm trying to say is that whether you like it or not, whether you agree or not, there are elements of what Hamas may have sought out in the beginning as a social movement, and it metastasized into this. There are people who would buy into elements of their approach, not the violent ones, right? But from a, and again, I'm saying like at my basic level of understanding, right? But I presume that there's a religious interpretation, right? A lifestyle that's, and you're not going to, that people might hold that, right? And they might say, this is good for me, and it will stay with me and my family, and I'm not going to try and impose it on other people, force other people to behave in a certain way. I'm not going to go out and be violent about it, but I want to be, live a life that's modeled by this approach. It sounds reasonable. I don't know enough to say like, oh, that's possible, that's likely. Is that even just a thing, or Hamas is totally just a political body that doesn't really represent? It's just dedicates its three things and three things only, and none of it has to actually reflect a way of life, but just a greater war attack on Israel. I don't know, but still, what you're saying rings true to the extent that that's possible. Sure,
precisely, and there are social and religious elements of Hamas. Like, in principle, I don't like political Islam or Islamism, which is what Islamism is political Islam. However, them in a democratic context, if they want to have part of the political landscape, if you will, as a group, just like any other, with rights and responsibilities, I think that's entirely reasonable, as much as I personally don't like the ideology rather. What is a problem is if that political Islam is coupled with a violent program that, again, goes against what the Palestinian people have embraced in the 90s and tried to embrace, which is nonviolence, nonviolent resistance, political negotiations to try to achieve results. And that's what Hamas spoiled, parallel with the Israeli right and Netanyahu in the 90s, who were inciting against Yitzhak Rabin on one side and inciting against Yasser Arafat. For all of Yasser Arafat's fault, he withstood tremendous pressure from Hamas and Islamists and people backed by the Islamic Republic of Iran who wanted to spoil the peace process. And that's what Hamas did. And in a way, they served as the useful idiot that enabled anti-Palestinian forces within Israel to say, we don't have a partner. And so I still believe that, this goes back to the piece about Gaza. I think a good chunk of Hamas right now probably don't want to be going back to being a government in a way. I think Hamas wants to just ensure that its political survival is secured. But I doubt that Hamas at this point has any interest in being a government in Gaza, because they know that the minute the war stops, there will be a reckoning. The people of Gaza have been focused on survival right now. Why do you think Sinwar hasn't put out a single video message since the beginning of October 7th? I've asked a multitude of Gazans and Palestinians, because and what they tell me is Gazans will eat him alive. Like, he is so deeply hated right now, so deeply unpopular, because he made this decision. It was a military coup, even against the political groups. By the way, I was traveling in Europe, and I met with a Palestinian journalist in the West Bank who specializes in Hamas, and he met with Hania right before he was assassinated. And what I asked him, why do you think they did the Sinwar decision? That was the stupidest thing from so many different levels. He said, no, this actually is a demonstration of the fissures within Hamas, many of whom are against prolonging the war, against what October 7th has done to them and to the Palestinian people. And they said this was their way of saying to Sinwar, you broke it, you own it, you started this, and now this is on you. We're making you leader, not because they believe, and they know his days are numbered, but not because they necessarily believe that Sinwar is the most brilliant man in Hamas, but because they're throwing it back at him and saying, you screwed this up, and so it's on you to fix it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, even in Israel, like a lot of the media was saying that he was not interested in the position, and they're like, too bad. You know, there is something that you said earlier that I don't know how to broach this. I mean, we don't have the time to broach this in a full way, and this might mean that you have to come back again for a fourth conversation. But I'm curious about this because the way you describe it, and I mean, and from my lived experience, you know, certainly, but I'd say even more so, is I do think, as far as I know and remember, there were moments in the 90s where, you know, hope was on the horizon. You know, I was younger then, I remember, but I still remember the feeling. I certainly very much lived through the lamentation that many parts of Israeli society, despite which wasn't my organic, you know, educational surrounding, not in my home. My home was different, but you know, I lived in I ended up being in a high school in a more right-wing conservative kind of situation within a larger settlement. You know, but I lived through the second Intifada. I remember the first Intifada. But that's not to say that I don't recall like this ethos of like we were on the brink of peace and prosperity. Mm-hmm. And I know what broke it, and I'm familiar with all that stuff. But the part that I struggle with, and I'm being honest here, is that you know, and this is, you know, back to the beginning of this, like why I'm so like happy, quote unquote. I mean, not quote unquote. I'm happy that you know that you know so long as we can verify this is true and correct. But even if it's not true, I'm still hopeful. I want to cling on to that. The polls were wrong. And most Palestinians in Gaza were not happy with October 7th and are against what's going on. That gives us an opportunity to kind of shape things differently. Like the ethos, the narrative, like the conflict is so long. Mm-hmm. It's so long, right? It didn't start in the 90s. It didn't start in the 80s, not in the 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, right? There were issues for a very long time, and like the point isn't to like do a counting of like, oh, who did what and when and who's the fault and why is this and that, but it is to say that I feel like there's been an arc of at the very least with the Arab world and the Muslim world, coming to terms with Israel, mm-hmm. right? That's like the most modest version of the evolution, mm-hmm. to a full-on acceptance of like this is like a positive. Mm-hmm. And so my question is like, how do we get more of that, right? Because you talked about the necessary security pieces. You talked about allowing, you know, there's parts that Israel needs to do, which means to, you know, stop the expansion of settlements and kind of reel that in, and likely we'll have to at some point clear out some of them, mm-hmm. And figure out all that messiness. But there's something about like the story that we tell ourselves, and how do we kind of graduate into this place of saying, can you imagine what the Middle East and the Mediterranean coastline would look like if we can take a train from, you know, all the way up in Lebanon and north of that and all the way down, you know, and get to Egypt, you know, and just like travel between these different countries and these different cultures, and kind of like that's like the utopian type of, you know, version of this. And I wonder like how do we propagate that story? How do we get that out there so that we are not just like, oh, I mean, security needs are important, but it's not just around that, but it's a much more expansive, inclusive, hopeful story.
It all starts with Gaza, in my opinion. This is why I feel strongly about a Gaza-first approach, because it overlooks the Mediterranean as a gas field. It can have an airport, and I tried to build an airport in Gaza. It had an airport that I flew into in '99 and 2000. It can have a seaport and should have a seaport. I mean, this is part of why I pushed for the airdrops, is to show that the food airdrops, is to show that no security issue is insurmountable if we do coordinate with Israel. Gaza's airspace went from being off limits for basically 23 years, except for Israeli military aviation, to having dozens of countries flying their air forces and their cargo airplanes over. And to me, that was just a symbolic opening of Gaza's airspace in a way that gave me hope that this can work in the future. And so I've long aspired to have some kind of a connection between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel in Gaza, through a rail line, through the airport and through the seaport. Yeah. And imagine a rail line that passes from Gaza through the Negev desert all the way to Saudi Arabia. And it connects also to Jordan. We can have the corridor between Gaza and the West Bank. If we get Gaza right, and Gaza's small in space. You only have 2.3 million people. There's a lot to be done. But if we get Gaza right, I genuinely think it can be the role model for solving the West Bank. It can be the stabilizing anchor, if you will, for beginning to isolate the Islamic Republic and beginning to undo the resistance narrative. Because here's the thing, we need to, in order to effectively dismantle the resistance narrative, we have to empower the moderates. We have to show that peace pays off, not just in terms of economic opportunities, but in terms of freedom and liberation and coexistence. And this is where I believe that we as Palestinians, to gain our freedom, we need Israelis. We cannot impose a solution upon the Israelis. And some will be like, well, what do you mean? We need to be nice to the occupiers and occupation. My saying is like, no, we shift the narrative. We shift the conversation into one of positivity. Peace as a courageous, positive evolution that is positive and impactful and empowering to the Palestinian people to give them the space and the freedom and the sovereignty and independence they need to build themselves up. And so I stand by that belief that solving Gaza is regional stability passes through Gaza. It starts with Gaza. And that's why, and it's funny, it's been funny, I've been socializing this term Gaza first, and people misunderstand it and they wonder if this is like the MAGA of Gaza, of Palestine, if you will. But my thing is, again, to prove, because there will also be those on the Israeli side, just as there are on the Palestinian side, but there will be some on the Israeli side who are basically, they don't believe there could ever be peace with the Palestinians, or to them at best, peace is let us basically keep your mouth shut and don't do anything. And so I want to prove those people right, and if we have to stand before an international forum to say, look at Gaza and how we have turned the ship around, and this is what an occupation-free West Bank would look like. Yeah. That, to me, is inspirational. That, to me, is the building block for a new future, a Palestine 2.0, the connectivity. And you know what? It might not include Lebanon starting. It might not include Syria. But I absolutely believe in, a coastline railroad, coastline railroad, if you will. Like when I was in Gaza, man, that infrastructure weirdly inspired me because I had flown into Gaza's airport and it was destroyed in 2002 completely. 2001, Israel bombed a few facilities, and then 2002 just took out the runway. But that airport inspired me in the possibility of it and the seaport.
Yeah, but they rebuilt it afterwards. Wasn't it destroyed again in 2006 afterwards when Hamas took over?
Well, it was never really rebuilt. When it was destroyed, it was basically recycled. A lot of the building materials and a lot of the, because of the blockade and the restrictions, Hamas and other scrappers and criminals, if you will, just tore through the facilities and took all the rebar, took all the cement blocks, and took all the rebar that was in the runway.
But I don't want to get off track because you were in such an inspiring.
No, exactly. But that's what I'm saying. Like what you just said, what you said about envisioning, inspiring hope, I genuinely think passes through Gaza. And so it's difficult for people because the pain is so immense right now, and the horrors, and I struggle with this myself, with my family and my brother and what remains of my aunts and my uncles, and the death of my friends. And just a couple of days ago, one of my really good friends was a super opponent to Hamas, and during the war in Gaza, and his brother and sister were just killed by an IDF raid. So it's killing Hamas opponents and Hamas proponents alike. So that's why I'm saying, in the short term, I understand folks, particularly in the territories and in Palestine, are struggling to think of what the future looks like. That's why it's incumbent upon us, with privilege, with the safety and the relative separation from it at a visceral level. I'm not separated. This is my whole life right now. But to come up with these visions, and these visions being pragmatic, being based on empathy and humanity, and also being realistic in the need to transform and the need for change to come from within first before we can ask the Israelis for it. And then finally, to get rid of these maximalist utopia, slogans and visions, and from the river to the sea. And there are some people that know armed resistance is not going to work. But to them, they're like, just was talking to this guy the other day, and he was like, we will be occupied for 100 years before we give up. And I was like, wow, how stupid. Like, how ridiculous. Like, my goodness, why? You're going to destroy the Palestinian people with these narratives. But unfortunately, these narratives now have a lot of legs to walk on in the Western world and in the so-called pro-Palestine movement, which, again, I'm not out to delegitimize the pro-Palestine movement. I am just frustrated that large parts of the movement have been taken over by unhelpful voices, by unpragmatic voices, by ideological and maximalist and reductionist voices. The enemy of the good is the perfect. There's not going to be a perfect solution to this. But let's solve Gaza. We stop the killing. We initiate political transformation. We allow Gaza to develop into its full potential. And I'm not necessarily talking about a neoliberal Singapore economic model. I want it to work for all of Gazans because I don't want just one class of people to rise and become the oligarchs and everybody else to remain aid-dependent refugees. I want truly empowering transformation and capitalism and prosperity. And I see it, I feel it, I visualize it. And I see how in 5 years, if we have the building blocks of that, within 10 years, there can absolutely be a viable, vibrant Palestinian state. We can prove to Israelis and to the whole world that doesn't want to invest a single more penny into Gaza only to be destroyed again, that the next battle is not one with rockets and tunnels. The next battle is one of nation building and of state building and of focusing on us, investing in us as Palestinian people.
Yeah. So that was beautifully said. And one thing I would add, and I'm sure you meant this implicitly, but before proving to Israel, before proving to the world, to prove to yourselves, to the Palestinian people, that this is possible.
Certainly. So, I mean, without a doubt, I mean, that is the target audience. That is, but I genuinely think, though, like, the reason why I didn't include it is it goes without saying that in order, like anything that I'm thinking about, I mean, the point that I was trying to make is that, of course, this whole has to work for the Palestinian people. But in order for it to work for the Palestinian people, in order to get the kind of action and steps and strategies and visions that work for the Palestinian people, we need buy-in from the allies in the region, the Arabs and the Muslims. We need the Israelis on board. We need Israel to open Gaza up and to allow Gaza. And I know that's difficult for so many people with October 7th being so fresh in people's mind to think, we need to open Gaza up. But that is exactly the antidote to further radicalization and to further, the more Gaza's isolated, the worse off Israel will be strategically and in the long term. If Gaza's opened up, and I mean fully opened up for trade and commerce, and we can address security issues, but if it's opened up for trade and commerce and travel and development, and we allow tourism, we allow diaspora Palestinians to visit Gaza, to have a sense of identity and connection, and to meet actual Palestinians instead of being in Western college campuses projecting their vision of what their people want, that can actually create just so many intangible benefits that work towards that linear progression towards a Palestinian state with sovereignty and independence living side by side with Israel, there being separation after this much conflict, but Israel also being an integral part of the Palestinian success story, and in so doing, being well integrated within the region, with Egypt and the Gulf states and Jordan and beyond. And I see that, like I said, this is not kumbaya, this is pragmatism. I think there are enough after what the people of Gaza have suffered. They absolutely want to see something different. And this is why I'm throwing my hat in the ring. This is why I'm walking away from a comfortable, quiet life, because I see the opportunity amidst the horror and the misery.
Ahmed, I think this is a perfect place to end. Unfortunately, I love our conversations, but that was truly inspiring, and there's so much more to cover and so many more questions we can have, and I hope we will have more of these conversations, formally and informally. But really, thank you again for joining us for this installment of our now 3-part conversation. And there's so much more. I'll say this also in the introduction, but people should be watching you closely and supporting you in your work, because the success of what you will do will really impact many people in the region, hopefully. And we didn't cover it, but lots of luck on your move to DC.
Thank you. No, I'm nervous, but I'm actually excited. Like, I think the new phase is going to be like serious business, and it will give me an opportunity to elevate my voice. Because I don't want to just be an activist forever. I don't want to be a writer forever. I don't want to be a Facebook or a Twitter guy forever. I want results. I want things, because I've like I said, I see the writing on the wall. I see the possibilities and the opportunities, even as I struggle in the short term with how hopeless it is and how it's hard to see with Sinwar and Netanyahu being in power. It's really hard to see how we move forward. But we got to think beyond that. We cannot be so caught up in the immediate and in the short term that we fail to visualize something that gives hope to the Palestinians and to the Israelis. Both people, believe it or not, are desperately in need of hope. It doesn't mean it's a symmetric desire for hope. I know the Israelis want to move on with their lives and want to live quiet lives. They don't want to deal with security issues. They don't want to, but the Palestinians also want to move on with their lives in terms of being given an opportunity to build themselves up and to not be aid dependent and to be free of violence and intimidation and subjugation. And so I see both people's desperate pleas for hope, regardless of the asymmetry of the power dynamics, as something that we have to feed, we have to inspire. And again, not just with kumbaya, but with pragmatic, realistic visions, rather than with destructive, harmful, hateful, vitriolic narratives.
Right. Well said. Couldn't say it better. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. This is
Thank
great.
you. Habibi. Good man.